Most people think history is shaped by inventions, leaders, or ideas. It isn't. History is shaped by moments where one side almost lost, and the world we know barely survived the outcome. There are wars you've heard of, and then there are wars that decided how civilization would function, yet barely appear in textbooks. Wars where, if the other side had won, your government would work differently, your laws would be different, your idea of freedom would be different, and in some cases, you wouldn't exist at all. These conflicts didn't just redraw maps, they selected which systems survived: centralization or independence, empire or city-state, obedience or debate. Every modern institution, from courts to currencies, borders to beliefs, traces back to battles most people don't even know happened. This video isn't about heroes or villains. It's about leverage, about the wars that quietly decided how humans organize power, and why the world still runs on those decisions today. The first of these wars was fought over 2,400 years ago between the largest empire on earth and a handful of cities that, on paper, should not have survived. This was the Greco-Persian Wars. At its height, the Persian Empire stretched from the Indus Valley to the edge of Europe. It ruled tens of millions of people. It commanded vast armies, endless resources, and a centralized bureaucracy unmatched in the ancient world. Greece, by comparison, wasn't even a country. It was a scattered collection of rival city-states: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, constantly arguing, constantly divided, and often at war with each other. From Persia's perspective, Greece wasn't a threat. It was a problem to be erased. And at first, that's exactly what seemed inevitable. Persian armies burned cities. Athens itself was abandoned and reduced to ashes. By every traditional measure of power, Greece was finished. But history didn't turn on numbers. It turned on one decision, one battlefield, and one moment where a smaller force forced a superpower to fight on the wrong terms. That moment came in a narrow stretch of water just outside Athens. At the Battle of Salamis, the Greeks lured Persia's massive fleet into a confined strait, neutralizing its size and turning coordination into chaos. What followed wasn't just a victory. It was a system shock. Persia lost naval dominance. Supply lines collapsed. Momentum reversed. And with that single defeat, the Persian dream of conquering Greece died. Not because Persia lacked power, but because Greece understood how to fight an empire without becoming one. From this point forward, the war was no longer about survival. It was about which vision of civilization would spread. The Greek victory didn't create an empire. It created time. Time for Greek cities to rebuild. Time for ideas, tactics, and military culture to evolve. Time for a new kind of power to rise just north of the Greek world. Because while Athens and Sparta argued over what victory meant, a peripheral kingdom was watching closely: Macedon. For decades, Macedon had lived in the shadow of the Greek city-states, considered rough, semi-barbaric, and politically irrelevant. But it absorbed Greek military thinking, Greek strategy, and Greek culture without inheriting Greek disunity. That synthesis mattered. By the time a young king named Alexander the Great came to power, Greece was no longer fighting for survival. Persia was no longer an unstoppable force, and the psychological barrier had already been broken. Alexander did not face a mythical, invincible empire. He faced an empire that had already been checked once, at sea, by smaller forces, fighting smarter rather than bigger. The Persian aura of inevitability was gone. Without Greece surviving that earlier collision, there is no Greek military tradition to inherit, no tactical foundation to refine, and no cultural confidence to export outward. Alexander's campaigns weren't born in a vacuum. They were made possible by a single earlier outcome, the moment Greece proved that an empire could be beaten without becoming one. What followed wasn't the end of a war. It was the beginning of a chain reaction. After the fighting stopped, Greece didn't rush to conquer the world. It did something far more unusual. It argued with itself. Freed from immediate annihilation, Greek city-states turned inward, questioning power, justice, truth, and the role of the individual inside society, not as religious doctrine, not as imperial command, but as open debate. From this came Socrates, who treated questioning authority as a civic duty. Plato, who asked what a just society should even look like, and Aristotle, who tried to systematize logic, ethics, science, and governance itself. What made Greek philosophy different wasn't brilliance alone. It was permission. Permission to challenge rulers, permission to dissect ideas, permission to believe that truth could be approached through reason rather than obedience. Those habits didn't stay in Greece. They were absorbed by later civilizations, preserved, argued over, expanded, and reused, not as a single ideology, but as a method. Question first, justify power, demand logic. And that intellectual tradition only exists because Greece survived long enough to develop it. Which brings everything back to one narrow stretch of water. If the Persian fleet had not been broken at Salamis, if Greece had been absorbed as another imperial province, philosophy would not have disappeared entirely, but it would not have evolved in the same way. It would not have centered the individual. It would not have treated debate as sacred, and it would not have been exported outward by later generations. So the legacy of that battle isn't found only in military history. It lives in how humans learned to argue, to reason, and to question power itself. That is why the Greco-Persian Wars matter. Not because Greece won a war, but because the world inherited the consequences of that victory. While Greece was debating philosophy and China was consolidating empire, the Indian subcontinent was experiencing something rare in ancient history: stability. Under the Gupta Empire, large parts of India were unified under a relatively light central state. Trade flourished, cities expanded, and intellectual life exploded. This period produced advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and architecture, including the formal use of zero and early algebraic thinking. But like many golden ages, it was more fragile than it looked. To the northwest, a new pressure was building. Nomadic confederations, known in India as the Hunas, often associated with the Huns, began pushing south through Central Asia, following the same routes that had shattered empires before. What followed were the Gupta-Hunnic Wars. Unlike set-piece battles between equal states, this was a war of attrition. Fast-moving cavalry, repeated raids, collapsing border defenses, and a state stretched too thin to respond everywhere at once. The Gupta system was not designed for total war, and that mattered. By the late 5th century, the Hunas were no longer just raiding the edges of India. They had pushed deep into northern India itself. The Gupta Empire was still standing, its armies were still fighting, and in several battles, the Guptas even managed to push the invaders back. This was not a sudden conquest. There was no single moment where the empire was defeated and replaced. but the damage was already spreading beneath the surface. As fighting dragged on, the empire's tax system began to fail. Farms were abandoned, cities shrank. Trade routes that once connected India to Central Asia and the wider world became unsafe or unusable. With less money coming in, the central government struggled to pay soldiers or enforce its authority. Local governors and military commanders started making decisions on their own. Some raised their own armies. Others kept taxes for themselves. Loyalty to the center weakened year by year. What the Guptas suffered wasn't a clean military defeat. It was something far worse, a slow breakdown of the system that held everything together. The empire didn't collapse in one dramatic moment. It unraveled piece by piece. And once that central authority cracked, it never truly healed. India would remain culturally rich and intellectually advanced, but the political unity that had defined the Gupta age was gone for good. What followed reshaped the subcontinent in ways that are still visible today, even if most people assume those patterns were always there. Political power in India gradually settled into a regional rhythm. Authority lived closer to the local level. Courts, rulers, guilds, religious institutions, landholders. Loyalty was personal and regional rather than abstract and centralized. Over time, this produced extraordinary cultural diversity, languages multiplying, traditions evolving independently, legal customs varying from region to region. This richness is often treated as timeless, as if it emerged naturally from geography or belief. In reality, it was reinforced by a structure. Without a durable, continent-wide political framework, India evolved as a civilization where culture unified people more than the state ever did. Religion, philosophy, social hierarchy, and local custom carried continuity where central administration did not. This shaped how communities understood authority. Legitimacy flowed downward through tradition and status rather than outward from a permanent imperial center. That pattern had long-term effects on military organization as well. Armies were capable, professional, and sophisticated, but they were raised to defend regions, dynasties, and interests, not an abstract subcontinent. Coalitions formed when needed, dissolved when the threat passed, and rarely hardened into permanent institutions. Over generations, coordination at this scale became the exception rather than the default. At the same time, India became one of the most important economic zones on Earth. Its ports were active long before European ships appeared on the horizon. Indian textiles clothed populations across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Spices, metals, dyes, and finished goods flowed outward in massive volumes. Merchants understood credit, contracts, and long-distance exchange with a sophistication rivaling anywhere in the world. But trade developed without a single naval imperial state, enforcing dominance over the oceans. Commerce thrived horizontally, not vertically. Cities and regions plugged into global networks directly, rather than through a unified maritime empire. This made India indispensable to world trade and at the same time structurally open. When new external powers arrived, they stepped into a landscape that was economically vibrant, politically divided, and deeply interconnected. Influence could be gained not only through force, but through access to ports, markets, rulers, and rivalries. This is where Britain enters the story. By the time British power began expanding eastward, it was operating at a level no previous external force could match. Industrial output, financial systems, naval logistics, and global coordination gave Britain a reach that was fundamentally different from earlier empires. Its ships could stay at sea longer. Its capital could outlast wars. Its bureaucracy could manage territories across oceans. The British East India Company didn't confront a single sovereign opponent. It navigated a web of regional powers, aligning with some, undermining others, and steadily converting economic leverage into political authority. Control came first through trade agreements, then military protection, then administration, then taxation. This wasn't just conquest, it was absorption. And once Britain consolidated control, the effects rippled outward, far beyond India itself. India's labor, raw materials, and markets were folded into a global system that powered industrialization elsewhere. Textiles that once dominated world markets were suppressed. Agricultural patterns were redirected. Capital flows were reorganized at a planetary scale. The modern global economy, industrial Europe, extractive colonies, worldwide trade lanes hardened into place. That transformation changed the world permanently, but it only worked because the political landscape Britain encountered was fragmented enough to be entered piece by piece, rather than resisted as a single coordinated whole. None of this means Indian civilization lacked strength, intelligence, or continuity. It means that an early structural shift redirected how power functioned, away from long-term centralization and toward enduring regionalism. Over centuries, that decision space narrowed, shaping how trade worked, how authority was understood, and how outside forces interacted with the subcontinent. By the time the modern world emerged, those patterns were no longer choices. They were inheritance. What happened on the Indian subcontinent was not unique. It was one expression of a much larger force reshaping the old world at the same time. Across Eurasia, long-standing civilizations were being tested by the same pressures: overextension, internal strain, and relentless conflict along their frontiers. Some fractured slowly, others bled themselves dry fighting wars they believed they could not afford to lose. Far to the west of India, two ancient superpowers were locked into exactly that kind of struggle. For centuries, the Eastern Roman world and the Persian world had stood face to face, rivals, mirrors of each other, bound together by geography and hostility. Each had survived invasions, rebellions, and crises before. Each believed itself permanent. But by the early 7th century, permanence had become an illusion. What followed was not a single clash, but a grinding, total conflict that consumed entire generations. Armies marched year after year. Cities were taken, lost, and taken again. Treasuries emptied, fields went untilled, populations were drained not by defeat, but by exhaustion. This was the Sasanian-Byzantine War. And unlike the conflicts before it, this war didn't end with one empire clearly stronger than the other. It ended with both standing, and neither truly survived. By the time the fighting finally stopped, the old balance that had defined the Near East for centuries was gone. The Roman world in the East was hollowed out. The Persian state was politically brittle and militarily spent. Borders still existed on maps, but the systems that sustained them had been pushed past their limit. What mattered next was not who had won the war. It was what the war had erased. As in India, the real consequences would not arrive immediately. They would arrive through absence, through weakened defenses, fractured authority, and a world suddenly unable to respond to something new. because just beyond the southern deserts, a force that neither empire had prepared for was beginning to move. And this time, there would be no exhausted superpower left strong enough to stop it. What emerged from those southern deserts was not an invading empire in the traditional sense. It was a new organizing force. Within a single generation, the Arabian Peninsula, long treated by surrounding empires as marginal and yet strategically irrelevant, became the launch point for a movement that moved faster than either exhausted superpower could react to. This was the early expansion of Islam. It did not advance into a world of intact defenses. It advanced into provinces already stripped bare by decades of war. Roman garrisons were underpaid and understaffed. Persian authority was fractured by internal collapse. Local populations had watched imperial power fail them repeatedly through taxation, conscription, and endless conflict that brought no security in return. So when a new force arrived offering a different framework, one that promised order, law, and continuity without the weight of the old imperial systems, resistance was often muted, conditional, or absent altogether. Cities did not always fall in flames. Many changed hands through negotiation, others through simple abandonment by the empires that once claimed them. What spread was not just military control, but administration. Roads, cities, tax systems, and bureaucratic practices were not destroyed. They were reused. Roman infrastructure and Persian governance were absorbed and reorganized under a new authority. The result was not a collapse into chaos, but a rapid replacement of leadership at the top of an already existing system. This is why the expansion was so fast. It wasn't built from nothing. It was built on the ruins of two exhausted worlds. Had those worlds remained intact, had either Byzantium or Persia emerged from their war as strong and coherent, this expansion almost certainly would have stalled at their borders. Large empires are very good at containing new movements when their institutions still function. But the timing was exact. By the time resistance could have been coordinated, the opportunity had passed. What followed reshaped the entire arc of global history. The Near East, North Africa, and large parts of the Eastern Mediterranean were unified under a single civilizational framework. Trade routes, once split between rival empires, now ran through one interconnected zone. Knowledge moved more freely, goods moved farther, ideas traveled faster than they had in centuries. The region became the central hinge of the old world, linking Europe, Africa, and Asia not as a battlefield between empires, but as a conduit. And the political and cultural map that emerged from that moment never fully disappeared. Modern borders, identities, and conflicts across the Middle East trace their deepest roots not simply to religion, but to this precise historical vacuum. When the old imperial order failed all at once and something new stepped in to replace it. This is why the Sasanian-Byzantine conflict matters, not because of who won the war, but because of what the war made possible. What replaced the old Roman-Persian balance did not freeze in time. It evolved. The political and cultural order that emerged from that vacuum continued to reorganize power across the Middle East for centuries, eventually giving rise to one of the most consequential empires in human history, the Ottoman Empire. By the late medieval period, the Ottomans controlled the critical land bridges between Europe and Asia. They dominated Anatolia, the Levant, North Africa, and key Mediterranean routes. For the first time since antiquity, Europe found itself cut off from direct access to the richest trade networks of the Old World. Silk, spices, textiles, and luxury goods still moved, but now through an imperial system that Europe did not control. This mattered more than is often realized. European estates were not simply curious about the wider world. They were strategically constrained. When overland trade routes became expensive, politically risky, or inaccessible, European powers began searching for alternatives. Not out of adventure, but necessity. The oceans became the only remaining path around a closed continental system. This shift did not happen overnight, but once it began, it accelerated. Maritime exploration expanded, naval technology improved, financial systems adapted to long-distance trade. Empires that had once been regional turned outward, first tentatively, then aggressively. Colonial expansion followed. What began as an attempt to bypass Middle Eastern trade control eventually produced global empires spanning the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Entire continents were reorganized around extraction, shipping lanes, and industrial supply chains. In this way, the political order that followed the Sasanian-Byzantine collapse indirectly reshaped the entire global economy. Not because later empires intended to do so, but because control of the Middle East forced Europe to reimagine how power could be projected. The consequences did not stop there. As European empires rose, the Ottoman system itself came under pressure. Industrialized states began to outproduce and outmaneuver older imperial structures. Economic imbalance grew. Internal strains mounted. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire, the final inheritor of that post-Roman order, stood weakened but still intact. Then came World War I. The war shattered what remained of Ottoman authority. Provinces that had been administered for centuries were suddenly carved up by external powers. Borders were drawn quickly, often without regard for history, culture, or long-term stability. This was not a fresh beginning. It was another reorganization layered on top of an already fragile system. The Middle East entered the modern era not as a unified political space, but as a region shaped by collapsed empires, imposed boundaries, and competing external interests. These fractures deepened during World War II, when global power fully shifted away from old empires toward new superpowers. Colonial authority weakened further, but the borders and institutions left behind remained. Many of today's conflicts trace back through this chain, not simply to religion, not simply to ideology, but to repeated moments where external systems replaced collapsed ones, without ever fully resolving the underlying question of political legitimacy. The region has spent centuries absorbing the consequences of imperial exhaustion, rapid reorganization, and inherited structures, all layered atop one another. And beneath it all lies the same original fault line, a world where the old imperial balance vanished too quickly, leaving no stable successor. From late antiquity to the modern era, the Middle East has been less a constant battlefield than a hinge of world history, a place where global systems meet, break, and reform. The modern world did not begin cleanly. It began through inheritance. And many of the tensions that still define global politics today trace their deepest roots not to recent decisions, but to that earlier moment when two exhausted empires fought until neither could hold the world together anymore.